Okay, so we're diving into Canadian politics and this Mark Carney story. And wow, this is not your typical political story.
Right.
We're talking about someone who went from central banking rock star to leading Canada's Liberal Party.
Yeah.
I mean, how often do you see that kind of jump?
Not very often.
Yeah.
It's definitely a unique situation.
Right.
You usually see politicians kind of climb the ranks,
Yeah.
working their way up through, local or regional governments.
Right, right.
But Carney's coming in with zero elected experience,
Wow.
straight from the world of high finance and international diplomacy.
Yeah, that's what I find so fascinating about this whole thing.
Yeah.
He's a total outsider.
Yeah.
And yet here he is leading a major political party.
It's a gamble.
It's a huge gamble for the Liberals, right?
Absolutely.
Would you say that?
Yeah, the Liberals are facing some serious challenges right now.
Right.
You've got Trudeau's popularity on the decline.
Yeah.
A cost of living crisis hitting Canadians hard,
Right.
in a growing sense that the government's not doing enough to address issues like housing affordability and climate change.
Yeah, yeah.
They're hoping Carney can bring some fresh energy and credibility,
Uh-huh.
especially on the economic front.
So in your research, did you find anything that suggests why the Liberals think Carney is the answer?
Well, his resume is pretty impressive,
Right.
you have to admit.
Yeah.
He steered the Bank of Canada through the 2008 financial crisis,
Right.
preventing a full-blown meltdown of the Canadian banking system.
Right.
I mean, that right there shows you he can handle pressure.
Yeah.
And make tough decisions when it matters most.
Uh-huh.
Then he goes on to lead the Bank of England,
Right.
gaining international recognition for his expertise.
Yeah.
And if that wasn't enough, he becomes the UN's special envoy on climate action,
Right.
pushing for sustainable finance and global cooperation.
You're telling me it's like he's been training for this his whole life.
Right.
Just not in the traditional political sense. But can someone with that kind of background really connect with average Canadians
Right.
who are struggling to pay their bills and put a roof over their heads?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question.
Right.
He's trying to position himself as someone who understands both the complexities of global economics
Mm-hmm.
and the everyday challenges facing Canadians.
Okay.
He's calling it economic realism meets progressive ambition.
It sounds a bit like he's trying to have his cake and eat it too,
Maybe.
appealing to both fiscal conservatives and progressive voters.
Could be.
So from what you've seen, what are some of the key things he's promising to deliver if elected?
Well, he's got a few big ideas, for sure.
Okay.
One of his flagship proposals is Green New Deal 2.0,
Okay.
which aims to attract massive private sector investment to boost Canada's clean energy sector.
Okay.
Think of it as a kind of economic stimulus package,
Uh-huh.
but focused on green technologies and sustainable infrastructure.
Okay.
He believes this will create jobs, reduce emissions, and position Canada as a leader in the global transition to a low-carbon economy.
So he's basically saying, let's use market forces to tackle climate change
Right.
rather than relying solely on government regulation.
Exactly.
That's interesting.
It's a way of trying to appeal to businesses and investors,
Uh-huh.
saying, hey, there's money to be made in clean energy,
Yeah.
and Canada's the place to do it.
Right.
He's betting that this approach will be more effective in the long run than simply imposing stricter regulations.
That makes sense.
Yeah,
But it's still a risky bet, right?
but for sure.
I mean, attracting that level of investment is a huge challenge.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of skepticism about whether he can actually deliver on this promise.
Okay.
Critics argue that it's all well and good to talk about attracting private investment,
Right.
but without clear government incentives and a supportive regulatory environment,
Yeah.
those investors are likely to go elsewhere.
So green energy is a big part of his platform. But what about the other issues you mentioned, like the cost of living and housing affordability?
Right.
What's he proposing to do about those?
Well, he's got a plan called Housing First,
Okay.
which aims to use federal land to build more affordable housing units.
Okay.
The idea is to create a supply surge that will help bring down prices
Right.
and make housing more accessible for middle and low-income families.
That sounds promising. But is it really enough to address the housing crisis?
No.
From what you've seen, how significant is this issue for Canadians?
The housing crisis is a huge issue in Canada,
Right.
especially in major cities like Toronto and Vancouver,
Yeah.
where prices have skyrocketed in recent years.
Right.
Many Canadians are struggling to afford rent or enter the housing market,
Yeah.
and there's a growing sense of frustration and anxiety about this issue.
So Carney's plan to use federal land for affordable housing.
Yeah.
Do you think that will actually make a difference?
Well, it's definitely a step in the right direction.
Okay.
Using federal land could help reduce the cost of development,
Yeah.
which in turn could make housing more affordable.
Uh-huh.
But critics argue that it won't address the deeper systemic issues driving the affordability crisis, like restrictive zoning laws
Right.
and a lack of investment in social housing.
So even if he delivers on this promise,
Right.
it might not be enough to solve the problem entirely.
Exactly.
Looks like there's a lot more to unpack here.
Yeah.
What else is on his agenda?
Well, he's also pushing for something he calls tech sovereignty.
Okay.
Basically, he wants Canada to become a leader in artificial intelligence, quantum computing,
Uh-huh.
and other cutting-edge technologies.
Wow, that's ambitious.
Yeah.
From what you've gathered, is Canada even in a position to compete with those tech giants?
Well,
I mean, they're already light years ahead in many of these fields.
it's definitely a bold vision.
Right.
And some experts are skeptical about whether Canada can realistically achieve this goal. But others argue that Canada has a lot of potential in the tech sector.
Okay.
We have strong universities and research institutions, a talented workforce,
Right.
and a welcoming environment for immigrants, many of whom are highly skilled in tech fields.
Okay, so the potential is there,
Yeah,
but it's going to take a lot of work investment and a bit of luck to make it happen.
for sure.
So we've got green energy housing and tech sovereignty.
Right.
It sounds like Carney is trying to paint a picture of a Canada that's both economically competitive and socially progressive.
Yeah.
But the question is, can he actually pull it off?
That's what everyone's wondering.
Right.
And
Yeah.
there are a lot of factors at play here,
Right.
including the political landscape, the global economic climate,
Uh-huh.
and, of course, the man himself.
Speaking of the man himself, let's talk about Mark Carney, the person.
Okay.
From what you've read, what kind of leader is he?
Yeah.
And how does his personality and background play into all of this?
Right. Well, one thing that jumps out is that he's often portrayed as a bit of a technocrat.
Yeah.
Someone who's more comfortable dealing with numbers and policy
Right.
than, pressing the flesh and rallying a crowd.
Yeah, you mentioned that he doesn't have that same kind of charisma as Trudeau.
Right.
Or the fiery populism of someone like Poilievre.
Right.
So how does he plan to win over voters if he's not exactly the most charismatic guy in the room?
It's a real challenge for him.
Yeah.
You mentioned how much Canadians are struggling with the rising cost of living and feeling like the system isn't working for them.
Right.
Well, Poilievre's tapped right into that anger and frustration,
Yeah.
blaming the elites and promising to shake things up.
So how does Carney counter that?
Yeah.
It seems like Poilievre's offering simple solutions to complex problems,
Right.
while Carney's coming in with all these intricate policies and plans.
Yeah.
How do you think that's going to play out?
It's a classic clash of styles, isn't it?
Right.
Poilievre's going for the gut.
Uh-huh.
Well, Carney's appealing to the head.
Yeah.
Carney's betting that in the long run.
Yeah. Right.
Voters will be more drawn to someone who offers thoughtful solutions,
Yeah.
even if they're not as flashy or easy to understand.
So it's a gamble for the liberals, for sure.
Absolutely.
But getting back to Carney himself,
Okay.
we talked about his policies, but what about the man behind the curtain?
Yeah.
What's his story?
Well, he's had a pretty interesting journey.
Okay.
He started his career at Goldman Sachs,
Mm-hmm.
which is one of those big Wall Street investment banks.
Right.
So right from the start,
Okay.
he's in the world of high finance and global markets.
Wait, so he's one of those Wall Street guys.
Yeah.
But isn't he supposed to be this champion of the working class?
Right.
How does that square with his background?
It's an interesting contradiction,
Right.
and it's something his opponents are definitely using against him.
Yeah.
They're painting him as part of the Davos elite,
Okay.
those out-of-touch globalists.
Yeah.
Who are more concerned with their own wealth and power
Right.
than the struggles of everyday people.
The Davos elite.
Yeah. For those of us who aren't familiar with that term, can you explain what that means?
Sure. Davos is a town in Switzerland where every year the World Economic Forum takes place.
Right.
It's this big gathering of world leaders, CEOs, celebrities, you name it.
Yeah.
They get together to discuss global issues and network with each other.
So it's kind of like a club for the rich and powerful?
Exactly.
Okay.
And the Davos elite is kind of a shorthand way of referring to this group of people.
Right.
The criticism is that they're out of touch with the realities of most people's lives.
And they're saying Carney's part of that group.
That's the narrative they're pushing.
Okay.
They point to things like his time at Goldman Sachs,
Right.
his international connections,
Yeah.
even the fact that he was caught on camera wearing an expensive suit and sipping a latte.
Wow.
It all feeds into this image of him being out of touch.
I see. So it's not just his policies,
Right.
but also his background and image that are being scrutinized.
Exactly.
Do you think that kind of attack will stick? It's hard to say.
Right.
There's definitely a segment of the population that's skeptical of elites
Yeah.
and distrustful of global institutions.
Right.
And those voters might be receptive to the message that Carney is just another out-of-touch elitist.
That's a tough hurdle for him to overcome.
For sure.
But let's get back to Canada.
Okay.
You mentioned earlier that Quebec is always a key battleground in Canadian elections.
Yeah.
How do you think Carney's background and image will play in Quebec?
Right.
Especially given its unique cultural and linguistic identity.
Quebec is a complex and fascinating place politically.
Yeah.
You've got this strong sense of identity and pride in their language and culture.
Yeah.
And there's always been this underlying tension between Quebec and the rest of Canada,
Right.
with some in Quebec advocating for more autonomy or even independence.
So how does Carney fit into that picture?
Well, he's facing some headwinds in Quebec.
Yeah.
For starters, he's not from Quebec.
Right.
And his French is, let's just say it needs work.
So language is a big barrier.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
In Quebec, language isn't just about communication.
Right.
It's about identity.
Right.
And if you can't speak French fluently,
Yeah.
you're going to have a hard time connecting with voters on a deeper level.
I get it. It's not just what you say.
Right.
It's how you say it.
Exactly.
And if you're stumbling over your words, it
Yeah.
sends the message that you're not really one of them.
Exactly.
Right.
And that plays right into the hands of his opponents,
Yeah.
who can portray him as an outsider, someone who doesn't understand or appreciate Quebec's culture and values.
So the Quebec question is a big one for Carney.
Yes, it is.
What else are analysts saying about his chances of winning over Quebec voters?
Well, some argue that his economic expertise might appeal to certain segments of the Quebec population.
Okay.
They see him as a competent leader who can bring stability and prosperity,
Uh-huh.
especially in uncertain economic times.
So it's possible his economic credentials could trump his cultural shortcomings.
It's possible, but it's a tough sell.
Right.
Remember how much Canadians are worried about the rising cost of living and the lack of affordable housing?
Right.
Those are real issues hitting people's wallets,
Yeah.
and they want to see concrete solutions,
Yeah.
not just promises of a better future.
And what about his globalist image?
Right.
Do you think that's a liability in Quebec?
Yeah.
Where there's a strong tradition of social justice and skepticism towards corporate power?
It could be. You mentioned how Poilievre's tapping into that populist anger against the elites.
Right.
Well, that sentiment is definitely present in Quebec, too.
So it's a tightrope walk for Carney.
Yeah.
He needs to convince Quebec voters that he understands their concerns
Right.
and that he's not just another out-of-touch elitist who's going to prioritize the interests of big business over the needs of everyday people.
Yeah.
It seems like quite a challenge.
Definitely. And then there's the question of how he'll navigate Canada's position on the world stage.
So you're saying that even though this is a Canadian election, the whole world is watching to see what happens with Carney.
Oh, absolutely.
That's crazy.
Think about it this way. Carney's not just some random politician.
Right.
This is a guy who's rubbed shoulders with world leaders,
Right.
advised governments on economic policy,
Yeah.
and been a key player on the global stage for years.
Right. He's got this whole international reputation.
Yeah,
And now he's adding potential Prime Minister of Canada to his resume.
exactly.
So who's paying the closest attention and what are they hoping to see?
Well, from what I've gathered, the Biden administration in the U.S. is keeping a very close eye on Carney's climate policies,
Okay.
especially that Green New Deal 2.0 we talked about earlier.
Makes sense considering climate change is such a big issue for both countries.
Right.
But why are they so interested in what Canada is doing?
Yeah.
I mean, the U.S. is a global superpower, right?
Yeah.
Don't they usually set the agenda on these things?
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
But the U.S. political system can be pretty gridlocked,
Right.
especially when it comes to climate policy.
Okay.
There's a lot of resistance from certain industries and politicians
Yeah.
who are worried about the economic costs of transitioning to a low-carbon economy.
So they're looking to Canada for inspiration?
In a way, yes.
That's pretty flattering, I guess.
They see Carney's approach, which emphasizes market-based solutions and private sector investment,
Right.
as a potential model for their own climate policies.
Okay.
It's a way of trying to decarbonize the economy without resorting to heavy-handed government regulations,
Yeah.
which are often politically unpopular.
Interesting. So Carney could actually end up influencing U.S. climate policy,
Yeah.
even though he's running for office in Canada.
Right.
That's kind of a roundabout way of making an impact.
It just goes to show you how interconnected everything is these days.
Yeah.
What happens in one country can have ripple effects around the world,
Right.
especially when you're dealing with issues like climate change or global economics.
Okay, so the U.S. is watching. What about other countries?
Right.
I'm guessing the U.K. is paying attention considering Carney used to head their central bank.
Oh, definitely.
Uh-huh.
There's a lot of interest in the UK, but also a bit of mixed feelings.
Okay.
Some British progressives are disappointed that Carney decided to enter Canadian politics.
Right.
They saw him as a potential future leader for the Labour Party,
Okay.
someone who could bring his intellectual heft and global experience to British politics.
Yeah, I can see why they'd be bummed. He seems like a pretty sharp guy.
Right.
And he's got that international experience that's so valuable in today's world.
Exactly.
Mm.
But there's also a sense of pride, I think,
Yeah.
that one of their own has risen to such prominence on the world stage.
Right.
And there's a lot of curiosity about how he'll navigate Canada's relationship with the UK,
Yeah.
especially given Brexit and the shifting geopolitical landscape.
Right. It's a tricky balancing act for any Canadian leader.
Yeah.
You have to maintain strong ties with both the U.S. and the U.K., while also asserting Canada's independence and pursuing its own interests.
Precisely. And Carney's unique background with his deep ties to both countries
Yeah.
makes him particularly well suited for this challenge.
Okay.
But it also puts him under a lot of scrutiny
Uh-huh.
because people are watching his every move and trying to decipher what it means for the future of these relationships.
It's like he's walking a tightrope on the world stage.
Right.
With everyone holding their breath to see if he makes it across.
Exactly.
And speaking of world stages, remember that Canada is hosting the UN Climate Summit COP30 in 2025.
Yes.
What kind of impact could Carney have on that event if he's elected prime minister?
That's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people are thinking about.
Yeah.
Carney has already established himself as a leading voice on climate action and sustainable finance.
Right.
So his presence at COP30 would definitely elevate Canada's profile
Uh-huh.
and give the country a more prominent role in shaping the global climate agenda.
I imagine other world leaders would take him seriously given his experience and expertise on these issues.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not every day you have a former central banker turned climate champion leading a country hosting such a crucial global summit.
Exactly. And remember, how much is riding on this summit?
Yeah.
It's seen as a make-or-break moment for global climate action.
Right.
And the pressure is on world leaders to come up with concrete plans and commitments to reduce emissions and avert a climate catastrophe.
So having someone like Carney at the helm could make a real difference in terms of pushing for more ambitious action and getting other countries on board.
Absolutely. His credibility and global stature would give him a lot of leverage in those negotiations.
Okay.
Plus, he's shown a willingness to challenge the status quo and push for bolder solutions,
Right.
which is exactly what's needed in this moment.
So as you've been researching this, what's been the most surprising or interesting thing you've learned about Mark Carney and his entry into Canadian politics?
Honestly, it's the sheer audacity of it all.
Yeah.
This is a guy who could be enjoying a comfortable retirement,
Yeah.
giving speeches and writing books about his time in the financial world.
Right.
Instead, he's jumping headfirst into the messy world of politics,
Yeah.
taking on a huge challenge
Yeah.
and potentially putting his reputation on the line.
I know, right? It's like he's got this insatiable drive to make a difference.
Right.
And he's not afraid to take risks to achieve his goals. But as we've discussed, there are a lot of obstacles in his path,
Yeah,
both domestically and internationally.
for sure.
What do you think ultimately, can he pull it off?
It's impossible to say for sure,
Yeah.
but one thing is certain.
Okay.
Mark Carney's entrance into Canadian politics has shaken things up, injected a dose of unpredictability,
Yeah.
and sparked a global conversation about the kind of leadership we need in these uncertain times.
Well said. So for those of you listening, we've taken a deep dive into Mark Carney's unexpected political journey,
Right.
exploring his background, his policies, the challenges he faces, and the potential global impact of his leadership.
It's a fascinating story.
It is a fascinating story, but as we've seen, there are still many unanswered questions.
Right.
And the outcome of this political gamble remains uncertain.
Absolutely.
What's clear is that Mark Carney is a force to be reckoned with,
For sure.
and his story is far from over.
Definitely not.
Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.